the word that ended an empire. The door closed behind Cardinal Aurelio Marchetti at exactly 11:47 p.m. on July 3rd, in the fictional year of this story. He had walked into the private study of Pope Adrian VII, expecting a negotiation. He walked out 14 minutes later with nothing. Not his titles, not his influence, not even his voice. Because inside that room, the Pope had said one word. Just one. And with that single syllable, 4 decades of curial power collapsed like a cathedral built on sand. But to understand how one word destroyed the most powerful cardinal in modern Rome, we need to go back 72 hours, to a discovery that shook the walls of the Apostolic Palace, and to a pope who had been watching, waiting, and preparing for a moment that everyone around him thought would never come. It started with a phone call at dawn, a Tuesday in early July. Pope Adrian had just finished his morning prayers in the chapel of his residence when his personal secretary knocked twice on the door. That knock was unusual, not because of its timing, but because of its rhythm. 2 sharp taps, no pause between them. The secretary never interrupted prayer unless something demanded it. Adrian opened the door. His secretary held a single manila folder. No label, no stamp, no seal. Just a plain folder, slightly bent at the corner, as if someone had carried it under a jacket through the streets of Rome and slipped it past the gate before sunrise. This was left at the gatehouse, the secretary said. The guard found it leaning against the security post. No name, no return address, no note. Adrian took the folder. He didn't open it immediately. That was the thing about Adrian that confused people who didn't know him well. He never rushed. He had spent years in a monastic order, years in remote communities in South America, where silence was not emptiness but discipline. He placed the folder on his desk, poured himself a glass of water, and sat down. He straightened the bent corner. Then he opened it. Inside were 7 pages, typed, single-spaced, no letterhead, no signature, no identifying marks of any kind, but detailed. Devastatingly detailed. They outlined a network of internal communications between 5 senior curial officials, all coordinated through one man, Cardinal Aurelio Marchetti. The documents described a systematic campaign to delay, dilute, and ultimately sabotage the Pope's reform of the diocesan vicariate, a restructuring Adrian had been working on since February, designed to recenter governance around the cardinal vicar and strip away the bloated parallel structures that had calcified under previous administrations. According to the documents, Marchetti had been running a shadow decision chain, not through official channels but through private dinners at his apartment near the old Citadel, through encrypted messaging that bypassed the institution's internal communication systems, through weekend visits to curial apartments scattered across the city, where decisions were made over espresso and grappa, while the official committees waited for approvals that never came. For every directive Adrian issued, Marchetti had a countermove ready, a procedural delay here, a request for additional review there. An ally placed on a key committee to slow progress just enough that reform stalled without anyone being able to point a single finger at a single person. Adrian read every page twice. He lingered on one section in particular, a paragraph describing a private dinner in mid-April hosted by Marchetti, where 3 senior officials agreed to insert 27 new objections into a draft reform document that Adrian had personally reviewed and approved. 27 objections, each one carefully designed to require additional consultation, additional time, additional committees, the kind of bureaucratic multiplication that turns urgency into paralysis. Adrian closed the folder. He placed both hands flat on his desk. He sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the city was waking up. Delivery trucks on the cobblestones, a distant bell, the ordinary noise of a place that had no idea what was sitting on the Pope's desk. His secretary waited in the corridor. When Adrian finally opened the door, his face was calm, but his eyes were different, sharper, focused in a way that made the secretary step back half an inch without realizing it. That look meant the Pope had made a decision, and that decision would not be reversed. "Call Monsignor Brune," Adrian said. Tell him I need Archbishop Ferreira in my office before lunch." Archbishop Tomás Ferreira was the institution's quiet auditor, a canon lawyer with 30 years of experience navigating its labyrinth. He wasn't famous. He didn't give interviews. He didn't cultivate relationships with journalists. But he was precise, meticulous, and Adrian trusted precision more than he trusted power. Ferreira arrived at 11:15 a.m. He sat across from the Pope in a wooden chair that had held cardinals, presidents, and heads of state. Adrian handed him the folder without a word. Ferreira read for exactly 12 minutes. Then he looked up. His face was the color of old parchment. "If this is accurate," Ferreira said carefully, "it's not just obstruction. It's a coordinated effort to undermine papal authority, systematically, over months." "I know what it is," Adrian said. "Do you want me to verify it? I want you to prove it or disprove it. I don't need assumptions. I need evidence, and I need it before Thursday." Thursday was 2 days away. Ferreira understood the timeline and what it implied. He nodded once and left with the folder under his arm. What happened over the next 48 hours would later be described by insiders as one of the most intense internal investigations in the institution's modern history. Not because of its scope, but because of its speed and its silence. Ferreira didn't convene a commission. He didn't file requests through official channels. He didn't alert anyone in Marchetti's network. He moved like a man who understood that, in a place like this, bureaucracy was often the enemy of accountability. He started with the communications. The anonymous documents referenced specific dates, specific meetings, specific decisions that had been delayed or rerouted. Ferreira cross-referenced those dates with the official calendar and the internal records of 3 departments. Every single date matched. A meeting meant to approve new financial oversight protocols in March had been postponed 3 times. Each postponement within 48 hours of a private dinner hosted by Marchetti. A working group session scheduled for early April had been canceled because 2 of its 3 members received last-minute invitations to an informal consultation at Marchetti's residence. The working group never reconvened. But what Ferreira found about the vicariate reform was worse. The draft of the decree that would eventually become known as Confirma Fratris Tuos had circulated internally in April. Adrian had reviewed it personally, made handwritten notes in the margins, and approved it for final consultation. Then it disappeared into the machinery. When it resurfaced 2 weeks later, it had been returned to committee with 27 new objections. Ferreira traced those objections to 3 officials, all of whom had attended a reception hosted by Marchetti in late March. One of them had even used language that mirrored phrases from a private memo Marchetti had circulated to his closest allies. And then came the most damning discovery. A junior official in the Legislative Text Department had been approached in late April by one of Marchetti's allies. The request was simple. Draft a procedural memo arguing that the Pope was canonically required to seek the full Episcopal Council's approval before finalizing the vicariate restructuring. The memo would have created a legal barrier where none existed, giving Marchetti's allies on the council the power to block or indefinitely delay the reform. The official had found the request unusual. The canonical argument was weak. The precedent was questionable. But the pressure was real. He was told that important people expected this memo completed quickly. He drafted it. But he also kept a copy for himself, and a record of who had asked him to write it. When Ferreira came to his office, the official didn't hesitate. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a printed copy, and handed it over. "I didn't understand at the time," he said, "but I do now. They were trying to build a legal wall between the Pope and his own diocese, and they wanted me to lay the bricks." Ferreira compiled everything into a single report. 31 pages, cross-referenced, annotated, every claim supported by at least 2 independent sources. He delivered it to Adrian on the evening of the second day, placing it on the same desk where the anonymous folder had first been opened. The Pope read it alone. The windows of his study were open to the summer air. The city was suffocating under a heat wave that had pushed temperatures past 35 degrees, the kind of heat that makes marble walls sweat. But Adrian didn't notice the heat. He was somewhere else entirely, inside a 31-page document that mapped the architecture of betrayal. Cardinal Aurelio Marchetti had been a fixture of the Curia for 4 decades. He had navigated multiple transitions of leadership without ever losing an appointment. He had outlasted reformers who tried to reduce the influence of entrenched figures and largely failed. And when Adrian was elected, Marchetti positioned himself as an indispensable bridge, the man who knew how everything worked, the man who could translate between factions, the man without whom, the Curia whispered, nothing could get done. He was 73 years old, still a cardinal elector, still sharp, and, according to everyone who worked alongside him, the most politically skilled churchman in the city, and possibly the most dangerous. Marchetti's power didn't come from a single title. It came from accumulation. He held positions on 7 advisory bodies simultaneously. He sat on the commission overseeing the Financial Institute. He chaired a subcommittee on canonical procedures that technically had no binding authority but, in practice, influenced nearly every major appointment. He was consulted on everything from nominations to real estate. And he was present, always present, at the informal gatherings where the real decisions were made. Journalists called him the center of gravity. Diplomats described him as the man who kept things running. And, in many ways, that was true. The problem was that he kept things running in the direction he chose, not the direction the Pope had set. Adrian had suspected it for months. Small signs at first, a reform document that circulated to 40 desks when it should have gone to 5. A meeting rescheduled without explanation. An appointment delayed because of a procedural review no one could quite locate in the records. Each incident, taken alone, was insignificant, the kind of friction that exists in any large institution. But together they formed a pattern, and Adrian, for all his patience, was not a man who ignored patterns. On the morning of the 3rd day, Adrian made 2 phone calls. The first was to his Secretary of State. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. Adrian did not share the contents of Ferreira's report. He simply said that he would be meeting with Marchetti that evening and that certain decisions regarding the vicariate reform would be finalized the following day. The secretary, a diplomat by training and instinct, understood what Adrian was not saying. He asked no questions. He offered no advice. He simply said, "I understand, Holy Father." The second call was to the Cardinal Vicar. This conversation was different, longer, more direct. Adrian told him to prepare for the immediate implementation of the reform, restructuring the vicariate, reaffirming the Cardinal Vicar's authority, creating a new coordinating office, and eliminating the parallel governance structures that had allowed men like Marchetti to operate in shadow for years. The vicar was surprised. The reform had been scheduled for later in the month, possibly the next. Moving it forward meant confrontation. Publishing before the officials who benefited from the old structure had time to prepare countermeasures. He said as much. "Confrontation is not the goal," Adrian replied. "Clarity is, and clarity does not wait for convenience." That afternoon, the palace was quieter than usual. Many visiting officials had already left the city after a recent gathering of the wider college. The ones who remained were focused on logistics for an upcoming pastoral visit. Security arrangements, travel coordination, press briefings. No one was paying attention to the private study on the 3rd floor. No one except the Pope and the man he had summoned. At 11:30 p.m., Cardinal Marchetti received a message from the papal office. Not a formal summons, not a phone call, but a brief handwritten note delivered by a junior aide, asking if the cardinal would be available for a brief conversation. The wording was casual, almost friendly, but Marchetti was not a man who mistook tone for intent. He had been reading the subtext of institutional communication for 40 years. He knew that casual invitations at 11:30 p.m. were never casual. He dressed carefully. Dark suit, silver cufflinks, a pectoral cross given to him by a dying mentor decades earlier. A man preparing for battle wears his armor. He arrived at 11:47 p.m. The corridors were empty. The guards at the door stepped aside without a word, no expression on their faces. Inside, Adrian was standing behind his desk. Not sitting, standing. That detail would later be noted by those who reconstructed the meeting from fragments and whispers. Men in his position sit. They receive visitors from behind a desk, offering a chair, creating the familiar geometry of conversation. Adrian stood because he had no intention of making this a conversation. This was a verdict that had already been reached. All that remained was the delivery. Marchetti entered with the practiced ease of a man who had walked into this office hundreds of times. He smiled. He began with small talk. Something about an upcoming trip, something about the heat, the usual preludes that men like him used to read the temperature of a room before getting to business. Adrian let him finish. He let the silence return. Then he opened the center drawer of his desk and placed Ferreira's report on the surface. Cover page visible, 31 pages. He did not hand it to Marchetti. He did not explain what it contained. He simply placed it there and waited. Marchetti looked down. He saw the dates on the cover page. He saw the names. He recognized the structure of the document, the cross-references, the chronological organization that traced a line from private dinners to delayed reforms to blocked appointments. His smile did not disappear, but it changed. It became fixed, mechanical, the smile of a man who has been caught and is calculating his next move while pretending nothing has changed. "Holy Father," he began, his voice steady, controlled, reaching for the diplomatic register that had saved him 100 times before. "I can explain the context." "Enough," Adrian said. One word. Not shouted, not whispered, not delivered with anger or satisfaction. Spoken at the same volume, the same measured cadence Adrian used for homilies, for blessings, for conversations with heads of state. But the word landed like a gavel because it carried behind it the weight of 31 pages, the weight of months of patience, the weight of a man who had waited until he was absolutely certain before he acted. Marchetti stopped. His mouth was still slightly open from the beginning of his sentence. He closed it. He looked at the Pope, and for the first time in 4 decades of navigating power, of back-channel negotiations and informal brokering and strategic positioning, he had nothing to say. The word had closed every door he knew how to open. Adrian let the silence hold. 3 seconds. 5. 10. 15. The kind of silence most people rush to fill because it feels unbearable. Because the instinct is to talk, to explain, to justify, to negotiate. But Adrian was not most people. He had spent years in places where silence was not absence. It was the most powerful form of presence. And in that moment, his silence said everything his words did not. Then Adrian spoke again. "You will resign from every advisory body by Friday. Every commission, every subcommittee, every role. Your name will be removed from the financial oversight roster. Your position on the Canonical Procedures Subcommittee is dissolved, effective immediately. The Legislative Tech's Office will be informed that any pending consultations initiated at your request are suspended." Marchetti's jaw tightened. A muscle in his cheek moved. "You're asking me to disappear." "I'm asking you to stop hiding," Adrian said. "There's a difference." The distinction was surgical. It cut through 40 years of carefully constructed invisibility. Marchetti had spent his career making himself indispensable within the machinery while remaining invisible to accountability. Not invisible in the public sense. Everyone knew his name and respected his influence. But invisible in the operational sense. His power moved through channels that left no paper trail, through conversations never recorded, through decisions implemented by other people so his own fingerprints never touched the outcome. He was the ghost in the machine, and Adrian had just turned on every light in the building. "If you refuse," Adrian continued, his voice unchanged, The contents of this report will be shared with the full college, not as an accusation, as information. They deserve to know how their institution has been functioning. They can draw their own conclusions. This was the move that made Marchetti's position untenable, not the threat of exposure. The method. Adrian was not wielding the report as a weapon to punish. He was holding it up as a mirror and offering Marchetti the choice of whether to step aside quietly or be reflected in it publicly. And once the others saw that reflection, the verdict would not come from the Pope. It would come from the men who had unknowingly participated in a system designed to work around them. Marchetti understood this. He had survived 5 changes of leadership because he understood power better than almost anyone alive. And in that 14-minute meeting, he understood that the ground beneath him had shifted in a way no amount of political skill could reverse. This was not a man threatening him. This was a man who had already finished the chess game and was simply telling him the result. He stood up. He did not speak. He adjusted his jacket. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. For a moment it seemed like he might turn back, might try one last argument, one last appeal to tradition, to loyalty, to the way things had always been done. But he didn't. He opened the door, he stepped into the empty corridor, and the door closed behind him. The meeting had lasted 14 minutes. The next morning, while the city was still dark, Adrian was already at his desk. Before any ceremony, before any public appearance, 3 things happened simultaneously. First, the press office released the full text of the Reform Decree, reaffirming the Cardinal Vicar's governing powers, creating the new coordinating office, eliminating the requirement for council consent on key appointments, and streamlining the governance structure in ways that made parallel power networks impossible to maintain. The reform also scaled back the consultative framework that had been exploited by those who used consultation as a synonym for obstruction. Second, the financial oversight body announced a completely overhauled statute. The changes tightened accountability procedures, clarified reporting lines, and closed the administrative gaps that Marchetti's network had used to exercise informal influence over financial decisions. Third, and most quietly, Marchetti's name was removed from the published rosters of 7 advisory bodies. No announcement, no press release, no explanation, just an absence where a name used to be. The kind of change only insiders would notice. But insiders did notice, and they understood immediately what it meant. By noon, Adrian had departed for a scheduled pastoral visit to a small southern island, greeted by wind and heat. He prayed at a memorial for migrants lost at sea. He celebrated an open-air mass. He spoke about compassion and the parable of the Good Samaritan, words that would be quoted in newspapers around the world. But behind those public moments, something else was unfolding, a restructuring so thorough that observers would later call it the most significant governance reform in a generation, and Marchetti was not quite finished. That evening, while Adrian was still traveling, Marchetti sat alone in his apartment. The building was old, the ceilings high, the walls lined with books collected over decades. Theology, canon law, political philosophy, the library of a man who had made knowledge his weapon. He picked up his phone. He made 4 calls, 2 to cardinals in the capital, 1 to a cardinal abroad, 1 to another in a different country. Each conversation lasted no more than 5 minutes. He did not ask for help. He did not plead his case. He simply told each man what had happened factually, without emotion. And then he waited. He waited through the evening, through the night, through the early hours of the next day. None of them called back. That silence was the final confirmation. The network Marchetti had built over 4 decades, the web of favors and mutual obligations and shared secrets that had made him untouchable, had dissolved. Not because anyone had attacked it, not because Adrian had reached out to those cardinals first, but because the men inside the network recognized something Marchetti did not want to accept. The rules had changed. The kind of power he represented, The power of back channels and informal influence and unaccountable decision-making had been made structurally impossible by a leader who governed not through spectacle, but through systems. The next morning, Marchetti submitted his resignations, all of them. 7 letters, each addressed to the appropriate office, each containing the same brief formula, citing personal reasons and a desire to focus on prayer and reflection. The language was standard protocol. The meaning behind it was anything but. That same afternoon, Adrian arrived at the summer residence overlooking a quiet lake. It was announced that he would remain there for the following weeks, audiences suspended. He appeared briefly to greet the people gathered below. He offered a blessing. He smiled. But those who knew him well noticed something in his expression. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something closer to the feeling of a man who has carried a heavy stone up a long hill and has finally set it down. Not because the hill is over, but because the stone was the one that had been blocking the path. In the days that followed, the effects rippled outward. Junior officials who had been pressured by Marchetti's network found themselves free to do their jobs without interference for the first time in years. Appointments that had been stalled for months moved forward in days. A working group that had been established months earlier suddenly had clear authority to implement recommendations that had been sitting in draft form since April. The junior official who had handed over the procedural memo received a quiet reassignment. Not a punishment, a promotion. He was moved to a position with more responsibility and less vulnerability to the kind of pressure he had experienced. Adrian never spoke to him directly about it, but the message was understood. Perhaps the most significant consequence came from the wider college itself. At a recent gathering, Adrian had told them he needed their support to be strong, explicit, and public. He had asked for freedom, frankness, and loyalty. He had said that sincere counsel is always an act of communion. At the time, some had heard those words as routine encouragement. Now they heard them differently. Adrian had been warning them that loyalty to personal networks could never replace loyalty to the institution they had sworn to serve. An official who had worked in the Curia for 20 years described it simply. Under the old ways, reform was a conversation that sometimes led to decisions. Under this Pope, reform is a decision that sometimes requires a conversation. But the decision always comes. Marchetti retreated. He was not seen publicly for several days. He attended no functions, he gave no interviews, he issued no statements. The man who had been called the center of gravity became, almost overnight, a private citizen. Still a cardinal, still technically a member of the college, but stripped of every mechanism through which he had exercised influence for 4 decades. Some commentators speculated that Adrian had been too harsh, that a quieter resolution could have been found, that removing Marchetti so completely risked alienating other senior officials who might see themselves as vulnerable to the same treatment. But Adrian's approach answered that criticism implicitly. He had not acted on suspicion. He had waited for evidence. He had ordered an investigation. He had given the evidence time to be verified or disproven. And when it proved overwhelming, he had acted decisively, but without malice. He had not humiliated Marchetti publicly. He had given him the chance to resign with dignity. The choice of how to interpret that chance belonged to Marchetti, and the one word that had started it all, enough, was not a rejection of Marchetti as a person. It was a rejection of the system Marchetti represented, a system where influence operated in darkness, where accountability was optional, where the mission of the institution could be subordinated to the ambitions of the men who claimed to serve it. On the evening of the 5th day, as the sun set over the lake and the streetlights flickered to life, Adrian sat alone in his study. He had a stack of papers on his desk, more reforms to review, more appointments to consider, more decisions that would shape the direction of the institution for years, possibly decades, to come. He picked up a pen. He began to write. Not a decree, not a proclamation, just a note. A personal note in his own handwriting that he placed inside the original folder, the anonymous manila folder that had appeared at the gatehouse 4 days earlier, the folder that had started everything. No one knows what the note said. Adrian never told anyone. The folder was filed away and marked for restricted access, but those who saw him in the days and weeks that followed said he seemed lighter, more focused, as if the machinery of his office was running more smoothly now, as if a hidden obstruction had finally been removed. A place like this wears many faces. Power speaks through proclamations and through silence, through public declarations and through the absence of a name on a roster that nobody reads but everybody understands. But sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is say the simplest thing, the thing that cuts through all the layers of protocol and tradition and centuries of accumulated complexity, the thing that lands not because it is eloquent, but because it is true. Enough. One word, one leader, one cardinal whose 4-decade reign ended not with a battle, not with a scandal, not with a headline, but with a whisper spoken in a private room at midnight that echoed louder than any proclamation from a balcony. He had promised an institution that would not hide any more. On that July night, with the heat pressing against the windows and the city sleeping below, he proved he meant every word, not by fighting power with spectacle, but by walking into a room, looking it in the eye and telling it exactly what it needed to hear. End. This story and all characters within it are entirely fictional and are not intended to depict any real person or real institution.